Normandy, France. Hauptmann Klaus Weber pressed his field glasses against his eyes, watching through the morning haze as American infantry assembled in a farmyard near Mortain. His Panzer Grenadier battalion had dug into defensive positions during the night, preparing for the inevitable counterattack against Germany's desperate thrust toward Avranches. Weber had fought Americans before, from Tunisia to Sicily to the hedgerows of Normandy. He knew their strengths and their weaknesses. He knew they would call for artillery support before attacking his positions. And he knew, from bitter experience across 2 years of combat, that he would have approximately 3 to 5 minutes of warning before the first shells arrived, time enough to get his men into the deepest dugouts, time enough to survive the bombardment and emerge to meet the assault. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. At 0917, Weber watched American forward observers take positions in a stone barn 400 meters from his lines. He ordered his battalion command post to alert all companies. The Americans were preparing their attack. Artillery would follow within minutes. His veterans knew the drill. They had survived dozens of such bombardments from Russia to North Africa. The American artillery was dangerous, yes, more numerous than anything the Wehrmacht could field, but predictable. Always the same pattern, ranging shots first, then adjustment, then the main barrage, arriving gun by gun, battery by battery, as each unit received firing orders and calculations. Enough warning to take cover, enough time to prepare. At 0921, without any ranging shots, without any preliminary bombardment, without any warning whatsoever, Weber's entire defensive sector erupted in simultaneous explosions. 64 American artillery pieces, from 4 different battalions positioned miles apart across the Normandy countryside, all fired within the same 3-second window, every shell arriving at precisely the same moment, not gun by gun, not battery by battery, but all at once, as if some invisible conductor had synchronized every cannon in the American arsenal to strike at the exact instant when Weber's men were still in their foxholes, still waiting for the first ranging round that would signal the start of a conventional bombardment. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The devastation was absolute. 240 shells exploded within a 50-meter radius of Weber's command post in less than 4 seconds. His battalion headquarters ceased to exist. His company commanders, gathered for final defensive coordination, were killed instantly. His communications network, his forward observers, his reserve positions, all obliterated before any soldier could react. The follow-up assault met almost no resistance. The few surviving Germans, stunned and deafened by the impossible precision of the American bombardment, surrendered rather than face another such strike. What Weber never understood, in the final seconds before a 155mm shell ended his life, was that the Americans had solved a problem that had plagued artillery warfare since Napoleon's time. The problem of mass and time. The problem of how to concentrate the fire of dozens of guns on a single point without giving the enemy warning. The problem that would transform American artillery from merely effective to absolutely dominant, capable of destroying targets the gunners could not see, at ranges that defied traditional warfare, with a coordination that no other army on earth could match. The Germans called it the American Thunder. The phenomenon that made their defensive positions untenable. The mysterious ability of American artillery to strike without warning, to mass fires with supernatural precision, to coordinate batteries separated by miles of terrain as if they were a single weapon. German intelligence officers analyzed captured American equipment, interrogated prisoners, studied tactical doctrine. They found nothing that could explain it. No new guns, no revolutionary ammunition, just the same 105mm and 155mm howitzers the Americans had been using since North Africa. Yet somehow, inexplicably, those same weapons had become exponentially more lethal. The answer lay not in the guns themselves, but in an innovation so mundane that German analysts dismissed it as administrative bureaucracy. A small tent or bunker positioned behind the gun lines, manned by specialists with plotting boards, telephones, and slide rules. The Fire Direction Center, a concept so simple that its revolutionary impact on warfare would not be fully understood until decades after the war ended. The recognition that artillery did not need to aim at targets. That precision came not from the gun crew's eyes, but from mathematical calculations performed miles behind the front lines. That coordination was more lethal than caliber, and that information could be as powerful as explosives. In October 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Randolph Dickens sat in his office at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, reading after-action reports from the North African campaign with growing frustration. American artillery units in Tunisia were taking too long to respond to fire missions. Too long to calculate firing data. Too long to coordinate multiple batteries. The time lag between when a forward observer spotted a target and when shells actually struck that target averaged 12 to 15 minutes. In the fluid battles of mechanized warfare, that delay was unacceptable. Enemy units could move. Opportunities could vanish. American infantry could die waiting for support that arrived too late. Dickens understood that the problem was not equipment. American guns were as good as any in the world. The M2A1 105mm howitzer had proven reliable and accurate. The M1 955mm howitzer, though newer, showed excellent range and explosive power. The problem was process. Each battery calculated its own firing data independently. Each gun crew aimed at targets based on their individual calculations. When multiple batteries engaged the same target, their shells arrived at different times, giving the enemy opportunity to seek cover between salvos. The solution had been developing at Fort Sill since the 1930s, under the leadership of Brigadier General Carlos Brewer, Director of Gunnery at the Field Artillery School. Brewer and his instructors, including Major Orlando Ward, had recognized that modern artillery warfare required centralized fire direction, not just coordination between batteries, but true integration. A single command center that controlled all the guns, calculated all the firing data, and synchronized all the fires. The concept challenged every traditional assumption about how artillery operated. For centuries, artillery had been a direct-fire weapon. Gunners aimed at targets they could see, adjusting their aim by observing where their shots landed. Even after the development of indirect fire in the late 1800s, when guns began shooting over terrain features at targets beyond visual range, the basic principle remained unchanged. Each gun crew was responsible for their own calculations, their own aiming, their own adjustments. Battery commanders might coordinate general targets, but individual crews made the precise decisions about how to hit those targets. Brewer's innovation inverted this entire structure. He proposed removing aiming calculations from the gun crews entirely. Instead, all target information would flow to a centralized fire direction center, where specialists with superior maps, instruments, and mathematical tools would compute exact firing data for every gun. The gun crews would simply execute the orders they received, setting their pieces to prescribed elevation and deflection angles without knowing or caring what they were shooting at. Trust would replace initiative. Precision would replace improvisation. Mathematical accuracy would replace experienced judgment. The concept met fierce resistance from traditionalists who argued that experienced gun crews could aim faster and more accurately than distant headquarters personnel. That removing aiming authority from the gunners themselves would slow response times and reduce flexibility. That artillery warfare required the judgment and skill of veterans who could see the terrain, understand the tactical situation, and make split-second decisions about how to engage targets effectively. Brewer countered with mathematics. A centralized fire direction center with proper instruments and trained personnel could calculate firing data more accurately than any individual gun crew. The FDC could account for variables that individual crews often ignored: meteorological conditions, propellant temperature, bore wear, projectile weight variations, air density, even the Coriolis effect caused by Earth's rotation. When all these factors were properly calculated, artillery could achieve precision that individual gun crews could never match. More importantly, an FDC could coordinate multiple batteries with unprecedented efficiency. When dozens of guns needed to engage the same target, the FDC could calculate firing data for each weapon simultaneously, accounting for their different positions relative to the target, their different altitudes, their different ammunition supplies. The guns would fire at different times, calculated precisely so that all their shells arrived at the same moment. Time on target, a devastating concentration of firepower that gave the enemy no warning, no opportunity to take cover, no chance to survive. By 1941, Fort Sill had refined the FDC concept into a workable system. Forward observers would identify targets and transmit coordinates to the battalion FDC. The FDC would calculate exact firing data, accounting for all relevant variables. The FDC would transmit firing orders to individual gun crews, who would execute those orders without question. For time-on-target missions, the FDC would coordinate the timing of multiple batteries, ensuring simultaneous impact. The entire process, from target identification to shells on target, could be completed in under 5 minutes. Faster than traditional methods, more accurate than traditional methods, and infinitely more lethal. The first combat test came in North Africa. American artillery battalions equipped with fire direction centers engaged German positions near Kasserine Pass in February 1943. The results were mixed. American crews were still learning the new procedures. Communication between procedures, forward observers and FDCs remained problematic. German forces, experienced and well-led, exploited American mistakes ruthlessly. But even in these early engagements, German commanders noted something different about American artillery fire, a precision and coordination that exceeded what they had encountered from British forces, a responsiveness that suggested superior command and control systems. By Sicily, in July 1943, American artillery had refined their procedures. Forward observers operated closer to frontline units, providing real-time target information. FDCs processed fire missions with increasing speed and accuracy. Gun crews executed firing orders with mechanical precision. The integration of these elements created a killing machine of unprecedented efficiency. German prisoners reported that American artillery seemed to appear everywhere simultaneously, engaging multiple targets with devastating accuracy. But the true revolution came with time on target, missions. The ability to mass fires from batteries positioned miles apart, coordinating dozens of guns to strike a single point at exactly the same instant. The technique required complex calculations. Each battery had a different distance to the target, meaning different times of flight for their shells. The FDC had to calculate precisely when each battery should fire, so that all shells arrived simultaneously. It was like conducting an orchestra, where each instrument played different notes at different times, but the music reached the audience's ears in perfect harmony. The first successful time-on-target mission was fired by the 25th Infantry Division Artillery on Guadalcanal in 1943 under General Lawton Collins. 4 battalions, 16 batteries, 64 guns, all coordinated to strike a Japanese assembly area with perfect simultaneity. The FDC transmitted a countdown to all participating batteries. Each battery calculated their time of flight to the target. Each battery fired at the precise moment that would cause their shells to arrive with all the others. The result stunned even the American commanders who ordered the mission. The Japanese battalion formation they targeted simply ceased to exist. 400 men killed in 4 seconds, not by superior weapons, but by superior coordination. German intelligence first learned of time-on-target tactics from interrogations of American prisoners captured during the Battle of the Bulge. The descriptions seemed fantastic. Impossible. Artillery shells arriving simultaneously from dozens of guns positioned in completely different locations, as if guided by some invisible hand. German officers assumed the prisoners were lying, or had been traumatized by combat into irrational testimony. The Germans understood massed artillery fire. They had practiced it since the Great War, but they massed fires by having all batteries shoot at the same time, creating a rolling barrage that swept across enemy positions. They could not conceive of a system where batteries fired at different times, yet achieved simultaneous impact. It violated every principle of artillery employment they understood. The mathematics were elegant but complex. A forward observer would identify a target and transmit its coordinates to the battalion FDC. The FDC would plot the target on their firing chart, establishing its exact position. The FDC would then calculate range and direction from each participating battery to the target. These calculations accounted for differences in altitude between guns and target, for propellant temperature, for wind speed and direction, for air density, for every variable that could affect projectile flight. The FDC would compute the time of flight for shells from each battery. Then, working backward from a designated time of impact, the FDC would calculate when each battery must fire to achieve simultaneous arrival. The countdown broadcast began several minutes before. Impact. Time on target, Hotel Lima 01, T-3 minutes. Each battery commander listened to the countdown while monitoring his gun's readiness. At T-90 seconds, the FDC transmitted specific firing data to each battery. Charge setting, elevation, deflection. Execute on my mark. At T-45 seconds, gun crews loaded their pieces and set their sights according to FDC orders. 30 seconds. Battery commanders verified their crews were ready. 15 seconds. Gun crew chiefs positioned themselves to pull the lanyards. 10, 9, 8. Time slowed. Hearts pounded. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire. The guns erupted at different moments, staggered across several seconds. A battery 3 miles from the target fired first. A battery 2 miles out fired 3 seconds later. A battery only 1 mile from the target waited another 5 seconds before firing. The gun crews could not see the target. They did not know what they were shooting at. They simply executed the mathematical instructions transmitted from the FDC, trusting that unseen specialists miles behind the lines had calculated correctly. And then, 15 to 30 seconds after the first gun fired, every shell struck the target at once. The ground erupted in a perfect circle of explosions, so tightly coordinated that German observers thought they were witnessing some new type of bomb. The destruction was absolute, total, inescapable. The psychological impact of time-on-target fires exceeded their physical destruction. German soldiers had learned to survive conventional artillery bombardments. When they heard the whistle of incoming shells, they dove into foxholes or bunkers. After the first salvo landed, they assessed the pattern and moved to safer positions if necessary. Between salvos, they could fire at advancing infantry, operate weapons, maintain their defensive positions. Artillery was dangerous, yes, but survivable if you were alert and experienced. Time on. Target eliminated these survival mechanisms. There was no warning whistle because all shells arrived simultaneously. There was no first salvo to assess because there was only one salvo, perfectly coordinated. There was no time to react, no time to take cover, no time to do anything except die. The Germans who survived such strikes reported an overwhelming sense of helplessness, a recognition that no amount of skill or experience could protect them from an enemy who could kill what they could not see, at ranges beyond retaliation, with timing so precise it seemed supernatural. By January 1944, American artillery doctrine had evolved to make time on target the preferred method for engaging high-value targets. Battalion FDCs could coordinate fires from 3 or 4 batteries. Division FDCs could mass the fires of entire divisions. Corps FDCs could, in theory, coordinate every gun within 20 miles of a target for a single, devastating strike. The Americans had transformed artillery from an area weapon into a precision instrument, from a supporting arm into a decisive combat multiplier, from a source of covering fire into a primary killing mechanism. The impact on German defensive planning was profound. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Traditional defensive doctrine assumed that defensive positions could be hardened against artillery fire through proper engineering. Deep bunkers, reinforced dugouts, dispersed layouts that prevented concentration of fires. These measures worked against conventional bombardment, where shells arrived over time, allowing defenders to take cover and survive. But against time-on-target strikes, depth of fortifications mattered little. When 64 shells exploded in the same 50-meter area within 3 seconds, nothing survived. Not bunkers, not vehicles, not personnel. The concentration of explosive force exceeded anything defensive engineering could withstand. German commanders began reporting to Berlin that American artillery effectiveness had increased by factors they could not quantify, that holding defensive positions under American artillery fire was becoming suicidal, that even elite Wehrmacht and SS units were breaking under bombardments that seemed to anticipate their every move and strike with impossible accuracy. The reports were correct, but the explanations were incomplete. The Americans did not have better guns. They had better information systems, better communications, better coordination, and most critically, better mathematical fire direction. The Fire Direction Center represented more than just improved artillery tactics. It embodied a fundamentally different approach to warfare, a recognition that modern combat was too complex for individual initiative alone, that centralized control could multiply effectiveness, that information and coordination could be as decisive as firepower. The Americans were pioneering what would later be called systems warfare, the integration of sensors, processors, and shooters into a seamless mechanism that could gather information, make decisions, and execute actions faster and more precisely than human warriors operating independently. The FDC concept proved applicable beyond artillery. Air support coordination centers used similar principles to direct fighter bombers against ground targets. Naval gunfire support used centralized direction to coordinate ships' guns with ground operations. Even infantry tactics benefited from centralized coordination of mortars, machine guns, and rifles. The Americans were discovering that warfare was evolving from individual combat to systemic combat, where organizational integration mattered more than individual prowess. German military culture could not adapt to this evolution. The Wehrmacht emphasized individual initiative, tactical excellence, and the judgment of experienced officers. German artillery remained decentralized, with battery commanders making their own decisions about targets and firing. This approach worked brilliantly when German forces were attacking, when the initiative belonged to German commanders, when tactical flexibility could exploit enemy mistakes. But in defense, facing an enemy who could coordinate fires with mathematical precision, German decentralization became a fatal weakness. Their artillery could not mass fires like American batteries could. Their response times could not match American efficiency. Their coordination could not compete with American systems integration. By spring 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Normandy, American artillery had reached the peak of its effectiveness. Every infantry division included 4 battalions of 105mm howitzers. Every corps included battalions of 155mm howitzers and 8-inch guns. The 8-inch M1 gun, entering service in 1943, could strike targets 20 miles away, far beyond the range of any German counter-battery fire. These weapons, coordinated through fire direction centers and capable of time-on-target missions, gave American ground forces a decisive advantage in firepower. The Germans knew the invasion was coming. They had months to prepare defensive positions. They built the Atlantic Wall, an elaborate system of bunkers, obstacles, and fortified positions designed to throw the Allies back into the sea. German commanders believed these defenses could withstand any assault, that even if Allied forces established a beachhead, German counterattacks would drive them back before they could consolidate their positions. They had not factored in what American artillery would do to those carefully prepared defenses. On June 6, 1944, as American troops struggled ashore on Omaha Beach, German positions that should have been impregnable came under artillery fire of unprecedented intensity. Naval gunfire provided the initial bombardment, but within hours, American field artillery battalions had landed and established fire direction centers behind the beachhead. Forward observers pushed inland with assault units, identifying targets and calling for fire. The FDC's coordinated strikes against German strongpoints, pillboxes, and counterattack formations. Time on target missions devastated German reserves before they could reach the beaches. The pattern repeated at Utah Beach, Gold Beach, Juno Beach, Sword Beach. Wherever Allied forces landed, American artillery doctrine dominated the battlefield. German defenders who had survived aerial bombardment and naval gunfire found themselves facing field artillery that struck with the precision of aerial bombing and the responsiveness of direct fire weapons. Positions that should have held for days fell in hours. Counterattacks that should have driven the Allies back into the sea were shattered before they could form. The Atlantic Wall, Germany's greatest defensive achievement, was breached not by infantry heroism alone, but by artillery coordination that German military theory had not anticipated. As American forces pushed into the hedgerow country of Normandy, the Fire Direction Center proved its worth in close terrain, where visibility was measured in dozens of meters rather than miles. Forward observers positioned themselves in church steeples, hilltop farms, and anywhere else that provided observation of German positions. They transmitted target coordinates to FDCs using portable radios that had replaced vulnerable telephone lines. The FDCs calculated firing solutions and transmitted orders to gun batteries positioned in fields and pastures miles behind the front lines. Shells arced over the hedgerows, invisible to both sides, guided not by eyesight but by mathematical precision. German veterans of the Eastern Front, where they had survived years of Soviet artillery bombardment, reported that American artillery fire was qualitatively different. Soviet guns fired more, shells, created larger bombardments, inflicted terrible casualties. But Soviet artillery lacked coordination. Their fires arrived over time, allowing experienced soldiers to survive by moving between salvos, by recognizing patterns, by exploiting gaps in coverage. American artillery, by contrast, struck with surgical precision. A single time-on-target mission could accomplish what Soviet bombardments required hours to achieve. The lethality came not from volume of fire, but from perfection of timing. The hedgerow fighting revealed another advantage of the fire direction center system. Traditional artillery doctrine required that guns move frequently to avoid German counter-battery fire. But German counter-battery fire depended on spotting muzzle flashes or calculating gun positions from shell trajectories. American FDCs positioned their guns miles behind the front lines, far beyond German observation. German artillery spotters watching the front lines never saw the guns that were killing them. They could observe the impacts, the explosions tearing through German positions, but the guns themselves remained invisible, protected by distance and terrain. Without knowing where American batteries were positioned, German counter-battery fire became largely ineffective. This protection allowed American gun crews to operate with a level of safety unprecedented in artillery warfare. Throughout history, artillery had been hazardous duty. Gunners exposed themselves to enemy fire every time they shot. Counter-battery fire, air attacks, and infantry assaults all threatened gun positions. Crew survival rates were notoriously low, but American artillerymen in Normandy suffered casualty rates far below infantry or armor, despite firing more rounds than any previous campaign. The FDC system had made artillery deadly to the enemy while relatively safe for the gunners. The innovation of L-4 Piper Cub aircraft further enhanced American artillery capabilities. These small, unarmed observation planes, flown by artillery officers trained as pilots, could spot German positions from altitude and transmit coordinates directly to fire direction centers via radio. The airborne observers covered far more territory than ground-based forward observers could survey, identifying targets miles behind German lines. They spotted German artillery positions, supply dumps, troop concentrations, and headquarters locations. They adjusted fire by observing shell impacts and transmitting corrections to FDCs. Most importantly, their presence over the battlefield suppressed German movement. Any significant German activity during daylight hours triggered immediate artillery strikes, forcing German units to move only at night or under heavy weather that grounded the observation aircraft. German forces attempted to shoot down the slow-moving observation planes, but the L-4s flew too low for heavy anti-aircraft guns and too high for small arms fire. Fighter interception proved difficult because the American planes operated close to Allied air superiority zones, where German fighters risked being shot down themselves. The few L-4s that were lost to enemy action were quickly replaced, and their pilots' reports had already been transmitted before they were hit. The aerial observation system created a situation where German forces could not move safely during daylight, could not concentrate for counterattacks without being spotted, could not position artillery without being targeted by American counter-battery fire directed from the sky. By late June 1944, German commanders were reporting to higher headquarters that American artillery superiority was making defensive operations unsustainable. They estimated that American artillery was 3 to 4 times more effective than their own, despite having guns of comparable caliber. They noted the devastating effect of simultaneous impact strikes that gave defenders no opportunity to take cover. They described the presence of observation aircraft that made any German movement visible to American gunners. Most critically, they admitted they had no countermeasure to these capabilities, no way to neutralize American artillery advantages through tactical innovation or operational changes. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, personally reported to Hitler that American artillery was inflicting unsustainable casualties on German forces. He noted that well-prepared defensive positions were being neutralized by fire that struck with uncanny accuracy and timing. He observed that German counter-battery fire was proving ineffective because American guns were positioned beyond German observation and moved before German counterfires could engage them. He warned that unless German forces could somehow neutralize American artillery superiority, the Normandy front could not be held. Hitler, unwilling to accept such assessments, ordered von Rundstedt to fight more, aggressively, to counterattack rather than defend, to seize the initiative from American forces. This strategic guidance ignored the tactical reality that German counterattacks were being shattered by American artillery before they could close with American infantry. Operation Cobra in late July 1944 demonstrated the full maturity of American artillery doctrine. General Omar Bradley's plan to break out of the Normandy hedgerows required destroying German defensive positions in a concentrated sector near Saint-Lô. The preliminary bombardment involved not just artillery, but coordinated strikes by heavy bombers, medium bombers, fighter bombers, and every available artillery piece in the American arsenal. The fire direction centers coordinated this multi-arm assault with unprecedented precision, timing aerial bombardment to cease exactly when artillery fires began, preventing any gap that German defenders could exploit to reorganize. The artillery component of Operation Cobra involved every divisional and corps artillery battalion in the 1st Army sector. Fire direction centers calculated firing data for hundreds of guns to engage dozens of targets simultaneously. The coordination required managing thousands of individual fire missions, each calculated to strike at precise times, each coordinated with adjacent targets to create a rolling destruction that advanced with mathematical precision across German positions. The complexity exceeded anything previously attempted in military history. The success validated everything Fort Sill had developed over the previous decade. German forces facing Operation Cobra reported that they had never experienced anything comparable, not at Verdun, not at the Somme, not even at Stalingrad. The bombardment struck with such intensity and precision that entire defensive positions simply vanished. Companies ceased to exist. Battalions lost cohesion. Regiments became collections of isolated survivors who could neither communicate with each other nor resist the American assault that followed the bombardment. The psychological shock was as devastating as the physical destruction. Veteran German soldiers, men who had fought across Europe and Russia without breaking, refused orders to hold positions that would inevitably be subjected to such bombardment. The breakout succeeded beyond Bradley's most optimistic projections. German defences that were supposed to require weeks to reduce collapsed in days. American armoured divisions poured through gaps in the German lines, exploiting success faster than German commanders could react. The Wehrmacht in Normandy entered a crisis from which it never recovered. Artillery had proven decisive, not superior German training, not tactical initiative, not operational art, just mathematical coordination of overwhelming firepower, delivered with precision timing against targets that gunners could not see. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In August 1944, as German forces retreated across France, American artillery pursued them with relentless efficiency. Forward observers moved with advance guards, identifying targets of opportunity. FDCs processed fire missions within minutes, often catching German units during daylight movement when they had assumed they were beyond American artillery range. The 8-inch M1 guns proved particularly valuable during this phase, at their 20-mile range, allowing them to strike German positions far behind what the Germans considered the artillery front. Multiple German accounts describe being shelled in what they believed were safe rear areas, dozens of miles behind the fighting, by guns they could neither see nor locate. The liberation of Paris in late August marked a turning point in how Americans themselves perceived their artillery arm. Generals Patton and Bradley both publicly credited artillery with winning the campaign in France. Patton, not given to praising any combat arm except armour, stated that the American artillery won the war in France. Bradley noted that no other artillery in the world could have done what American artillery accomplished in Normandy. These were not exaggerations for propaganda purposes. They were accurate assessments of how fire direction centres and time-on-target tactics had transformed the battlefield mathematics of modern warfare. But the ultimate test of American artillery doctrine came in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes caught American forces by surprise, creating tactical situations where artillery superiority should have meant little. Surrounded American units, fragmented command structures, winter weather that grounded observation aircraft, and German forces fighting with the desperation of men who knew this was their last chance to alter the war's outcome. Under such conditions, traditional military theory suggested that American advantages in coordination and fire control would be negated by chaos and confusion. The theory proved wrong. Even under the worst possible circumstances, American artillery maintained its effectiveness. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded at Bastogne, coordinated artillery fire from elements of the 10th Armoured Division that had been attached to them. The artillery battalion FDCs continued operating despite being cut off from higher headquarters, despite German artillery fire, despite ammunition shortages. They processed fire missions using the same procedures they had employed during training at Fort Sill. They coordinated time-on-target missions that broke German attacks before they could overrun American positions. They directed counter-battery fire that neutralized German artillery, attempting to pound the surrounded garrison into submission. On December 23rd, when weather cleared enough for aerial resupply, L-4 observation aircraft resumed operations over Bastogne. Within hours, every German position within 5 miles of the town had been identified and subjected to artillery fire. German forces that had approached to within a few hundred meters of American lines found themselves under constant bombardment from guns they could not locate or suppress. The psychological impact was devastating. Elite SS Panzer divisions, units that had fought across Europe with distinction, found themselves unable to close with surrounded American forces because artillery fire made movement suicidal. General George Patton's relief of Bastogne demonstrated another aspect of American artillery superiority. Patton's Third Army reoriented northward in 48 hours, an operational maneuver of unprecedented speed and scale. The artillery elements of Third Army executed this reorientation while maintaining their fire support capabilities. Fire. Direction centers displaced forward, re-established communications, recalculated firing data for new positions, and resumed operations with minimal disruption. German forces attempting to block Patton's advance found themselves engaging American infantry, supported by fully coordinated artillery fires, despite the Third Army's rapid movement and the difficult winter conditions. The German counteroffensive reached its maximum extent on December 24th. From that point forward, American artillery dominated the battlefield. Every German advance was met with time-on-target strikes that destroyed assault formations before they could close with American positions. Every German concentration was spotted by observation aircraft and subjected to massed fires. Every German supply line was interdicted by long-range guns directed by aerial observers. The Wehrmacht's last great offensive in the West was broken not by infantry counterattacks or armoured thrusts, but by coordinated artillery, fires that killed what they could not see. At ranges the Germans could not match. With timing the Germans could not survive. Colonel George Axelson, commanding the 406th Artillery Group during the Bulge, later testified to Congress about the effectiveness of American fire direction procedures. He described one time-on-target mission on December 19th that engaged a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River in daylight. His group coordinated fires from 4 artillery battalions, 48 guns total, all firing within a 3-second window. The FDCs calculated firing data for each battery based on their different positions relative to the target. The countdown broadcast brought all participating batteries to firing readiness simultaneously. The strike destroyed the German battalion completely. 702 Germans killed by actual body count, with entire companies eliminated in less than 5 seconds of concentrated firepower, Axelson noted. That such missions had become routine by late 1944. What had been considered impossible 3 years earlier, when the United States entered the war, was now standard operating procedure for American artillery. Forward observers identified targets. FDCs calculated firing solutions. Gun crews executed orders with mechanical precision. The cycle repeated thousands of times daily across every front where American forces fought. The Germans, Japanese, and Italians all faced the same overwhelming firepower, the same uncanny coordination, the same mathematical precision that made their defensive positions untenable and their counterattacks suicidal. The Japanese experienced American artillery effectiveness in the Pacific theater, though under different conditions than European battles. Island warfare limited artillery ranges and complicated forward observation. Dense jungle terrain reduced visibility to dozens of meters. Coastal assaults required coordinating naval gunfire with land-based artillery. Yet, even under these challenging conditions, fire direction centers proved their worth. Marine Corps and Army artillery battalions established FDCs on captured beachheads within hours of landing. Forward observers pushed inland with assault units, calling fire missions against Japanese bunkers and defensive positions. The coordination between different calibers of weapons, from 60mm mortars to 16-inch naval rifles, demonstrated the flexibility of centralized fire direction. On Saipan in June 1944, American artillery destroyed Japanese defensive positions that should have required weeks of fighting to reduce. FDCs coordinated fires from Marine Divisional Artillery, Army Corps Artillery, and supporting naval gunfire to strike Japanese strongpoints with overwhelming force. The Japanese, expecting conventional artillery bombardments they had learned to survive during years of fighting in China, found themselves facing simultaneous impact strikes that gave them no opportunity to take cover or survive. Japanese commanders reported to Tokyo that American artillery was creating casualty rates that made defensive operations impossible, that even the most heavily fortified positions were being destroyed by coordinated fires. On Okinawa, in April 1945, the final test of American artillery doctrine played out against Japanese forces fighting with the desperation of men defending their home islands. The Japanese 32nd Army had constructed elaborate defensive positions in depth, utilizing Okinawa's terrain to maximum advantage. They planned to inflict such heavy casualties on American forces that the United States would negotiate a settlement rather than invade Japan itself. The strategy depended on making the American advance so costly in lives that it would be politically unsustainable. American artillery shattered this strategy. Fire direction centers coordinated strikes against Japanese positions identified by aerial observation, ground observers, and even radar detection of Japanese artillery fire. Time-on-target missions destroyed Japanese strongpoints that should have held for weeks. Counter-battery fire, directed with unprecedented accuracy, neutralized Japanese artillery before it could engage American forces effectively. The result was an American advance that, while still difficult and costly, proceeded far faster than Japanese planners had anticipated. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound. They had prepared for a battle that would last months. American artillery reduced their defenses in weeks. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the Japanese 32nd Army, wrote in his final report before committing ritual suicide that American artillery had made Japanese defensive tactics obsolete. He noted that no amount of fortification could protect against the coordinated fires American FDCs could deliver. He observed that American artillery seemed to operate with perfect knowledge of Japanese positions, striking targets with such accuracy that he suspected American forces had broken Japanese codes. The truth was simpler and more devastating. American artillery did not need code breaking. They had forward observers, aerial observation, radar detection, and fire direction centers that could coordinate all this information into precise firing solutions faster than Japanese forces could relocate their positions. By May 1945, as American forces prepared for the invasion of Japan itself, artillery doctrine had evolved to assume that American forces could deliver overwhelming firepower against any target within range of American guns. Strategic planning assumed that Japanese defensive positions could be reduced primarily through artillery fire, with infantry assaults required only to occupy territory already cleared by bombardment. The projected invasion plans called for artillery densities that would have exceeded anything achieved in Europe. With fire support ships, land-based artillery, and aerial bombardment, all coordinated through centralized fire direction systems. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki made that invasion unnecessary. But the artillery lessons of World War II shaped American military doctrine for decades afterward, the recognition that coordination could multiply firepower. That centralized fire direction was superior to decentralized initiative. That mathematical precision could achieve effects that no amount of individual skill could match. These principles, developed at Fort Sill in the 1930s and proven in combat from Normandy to Okinawa, became fundamental assumptions of how modern militaries operated. The Germans never developed an equivalent to the American Fire Direction Center. Wehrmacht artillery remained decentralized throughout the war, with battery commanders calculating their own firing data and coordinating only at the ties, highest levels. German doctrine emphasized the tactical initiative of junior officers, the judgment of experienced gunners, the flexibility of decentralized command. These principles had served Germany well in the offensive operations of 1939 through 1942, when German forces were advancing and could exploit tactical opportunities through rapid decision-making. But in defense, facing an enemy who could concentrate fires with mathematical precision, German decentralization became a fatal weakness. German artillery could not respond as quickly as American guns because each battery had to calculate its own firing data. They could not mass fires as effectively because they lacked centralized coordination. They could not achieve time-on-target strikes because they had no mechanism for synchronizing fires from multiple batteries positioned in different locations. Most critically, they could not protect their gun positions from American counter-battery fire, directed by observation aircraft and calculated by fire direction centers that processed target information faster than German guns could displace. German artillery officers recognized these deficiencies. Multiple after-action reports from 1944 and 45 noted that American artillery appeared to operate with superior command and control systems. German intelligence attempted to determine how American artillery achieved such coordination, interrogating prisoners and analyzing captured equipment. They found fire direction center equipment, plotting boards, slide rules, and communications gear. But they never grasped the full implications of centralizing fire direction. Never understood how the system integrated forward observers, FDCs, and gun crews into a seamless mechanism that multiplied the effectiveness of each element. Part of the German failure to comprehend American methods stemmed from cultural assumptions about warfare. German military culture venerated individual initiative, tactical flexibility, and the judgment of experienced officers. The idea of removing aiming authority from gun crews, of having distant headquarters personnel calculate firing data for weapons they could not see, struck German officers as bureaucratic centralization that would slow response times and reduce effectiveness. They could not conceive that mathematical coordination could outperform human judgment, that centralized direction could be faster than decentralized initiative. The Japanese faced similar conceptual barriers. Japanese artillery doctrine emphasized spiritual superiority and determined adherence to planned fires. Japanese gunners received firing orders from battalion commanders, who coordinated with infantry units through elaborate pre-battle planning. Once battle was joined, artillery fires followed predetermined schedules, regardless of whether targets remained relevant or whether tactical situations had changed. Forward observers existed in Japanese units, but they lacked authority to call fires independently. Adjustments to artillery plans required approval from senior officers, a process that could take hours when American procedures achieved the same results in minutes. Japanese military culture made adoption of American methods impossible, even if Japanese officers had understood the fire direction center concept. The Japanese emphasis on hierarchical authority, predetermined planning, and spiritual determination over material factors meant that the flexible, responsive, mathematically precise fire direction that characterized American artillery was philosophically incompatible with Japanese military thought. Japanese officers could observe American artillery effectiveness, they could document its devastating impact, but they could not replicate it because doing so would have required abandoning fundamental assumptions about how military organizations should operate. The Italian experience with American artillery was limited, as Italy surrendered in September 1943 before American artillery doctrine had fully matured. But Italian officers serving with German forces in northern Italy during 1944 and 45 provided valuable observations about American methods. Colonel Giuseppe Di Stefano, serving as liaison with the German 10th Army during the Gothic Line battles, wrote extensively about American artillery procedures. He noted the presence of forward observers with every American company. He observed the small tents or vehicles behind American lines that appeared to coordinate all artillery fires. He witnessed time-on-target strikes that seemed to him like acts of supernatural coordination. Di Stefano recognized that American artillery operated according to principles fundamentally different from European practice. He described it as industrial warfare, where artillery was treated not as an art requiring judgment and experience, but as a science requiring calculation and precision. He noted that American gun crews operated like factory workers, executing orders without understanding the larger tactical picture, trusting that higher headquarters had calculated correctly. The system worked because the calculations were correct, because the FDCs processed information faster and more accurately than individual gun crews could, because centralized coordination multiplied the effectiveness of every element. The long-term impact of American artillery doctrine extended far beyond World War II. The fire direction center concept became standard in every modern military. The recognition that artillery fires should be coordinated centrally, calculated mathematically, and delivered with precision timing influenced how armies organized their fire support systems. The integration of forward observers, fire direction centers, and gun crews into a seamless system became the template for modern combined arms warfare. The principle that coordination could multiply firepower more effectively than adding weapons-shaped defense planning for generations. Modern precision-guided munitions, GPS targeting, and computer-based fire control systems all descend conceptually from the innovations developed at Fort Sill in the 1930s. The technology has advanced enormously. Today's artillery can achieve accuracies measured in meters rather than the dozens of meters typical of World War II. Digital fire control computers can calculate firing solutions in seconds that required minutes with slide rules and plotting boards. Satellite communications allow coordination across global distances rather than being limited to line-of-sight radio ranges. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Artillery does not need to see its targets. Gunners do not need to calculate their own firing data. Centralized fire direction, properly organized and equipped, can coordinate fires more effectively than any decentralized system. Mathematical precision, applied systematically, achieves results that human judgment alone cannot match. Information and coordination are as important as firepower in determining battlefield effectiveness. The story of American artillery in World War II is ultimately the story of how innovation in organization and procedure can be as decisive as innovation in technology. The Americans did not win through superior weapons. Their guns were comparable to German and British artillery, sometimes inferior in specific characteristics. They won through superior systems integration, through recognizing that modern warfare required treating combat as a problem of information processing and coordination, not just as a contest of individual courage and tactical skill. The Fire Direction Center was not a weapon. It was an organizational innovation that made existing weapons exponentially more effective. The mathematics were not complex, requiring nothing more advanced than high school trigonometry and basic calculus. The equipment was mundane: plotting boards, slide rules, telephones, radios. But the integration of these elements, the systematic coordination of forward observers, fire direction specialists, and gun crews into a unified system, created a capability that transformed battlefield dynamics. Klaus Weber never understood why he died. In his final moments, watching his defensive positions erupt in simultaneous explosions, he assumed the Americans had developed some new weapon, some technological marvel that exceeded anything German science could produce. He was wrong. The Americans had not invented a new gun or explosive. They had invented a new way of using old weapons. They had recognized that warfare was evolving beyond direct combat into systemic combat, where organizational superiority could overcome tactical disadvantages. The mathematics were elegant. The execution was precise. The results were decisive. American artillery crews, firing guns they could not aim at targets they could not see, delivered firepower with a coordination that seemed supernatural to those experiencing it. But there was nothing supernatural about it, just systematic application of information, calculation, and coordination. Just the recognition that modern warfare required treating artillery as a system, not as individual weapons. Just the innovation of the Fire Direction Center, a mundane tent with plotting boards and telephones that revolutionized the mathematics of killing. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.